So today let us see the sequence of constructor calls in inheritance. Okay, in C++. Oops, it's the concept of oops, and many of you have told me that you have this doubt. So the sequence of constructor calls in oops. Okay, so let us see without further delay. So let us we have a class a base, have a constructor. Class base, then base, then base int k, the destructor base. Okay. And I have another class derived, public base derived, derived and derived. Semicolons are not required here. Confusion. So destructor. So this is my sequence of constructor and sequence of class. So in the class base, okay, and I have a class derived, class base, class derived from the public, which derived publicly from base, and I have base default constructor, I have base parameters constructor, and I have base destructor. And class derived also same way, derived default constructor, derived parameters constructor, derived destructor. Okay. So in the main function, let us do it here. Okay. Just use the tick marks. Okay. In the main, is the main function. If I write derived d, so it should have called the derived default constructor, but it is not the case here. If I declare object D of the derived type, then it should have, we understood that it should call the derived default constructor, but it is not the case here. From here, the compiler, the control jumps to the first to the base class default constructor, then it will be printing the derived class default constructor. So what is the case here? If I trigger this command derive d, then the control will first jump to the base class default constructor. First it will come here, second it will come to the derived class default constructor when I trigger this command derive d. So let us verify this thing, the constructor and destructor call sequence in a code string, which will be very clear to you to understand. Okay, let us move to the code string. I hope the code string is visible. So let me write hash include iostream using namespace standard. Okay. So similarly, I declare a class base with a data member int I. So base class default constructor. Okay, so see out base class default constructor called base class parameter is constructor int k. So see out base class parameterized constructor called semicolon. So again I have a class derived which is derived publicly from base class. So okay, I make it public. Why public? The default access specifier of in a class in C++ is private. If I write int I in private mode, then it is not inheritable, as I discussed in, as we have known in the previous classes. It will not be inherited from the base class to the derived class. So for inheritance purpose, the data members or the member functions must be public or protected. Protected is public is everywhere it is accessible, but protected, it is only accessible inside the class, but it can be derived from the base class to the derived class. If I derive a class from the base class, if I is protected, then I will be derived from base class to the derived class, the class which is inherited, the child class. Okay, from the parent class to the child class, inheritance will occur if I write int I declare a data member in protected access specifier. Okay, so this is the case. Okay, public base. I take another derived constructor, derived. Okay, this is derived class default constructor called. So let us see. Let us also use a destructor. Okay, sorry, base. So see out base class destructor called. Okay. Next is derived class default constructor called, then derived class derived int k. See out derived class parameterized constructor or semicolon. And also I write a derived class destructor, a tilde symbol, derived okay, see out derived class destructor called. Okay, so now let us trigger command. Okay, int main. So if I write derived d, so as per our conclusion, as per our understanding, if derived d is derived class d is called, okay, if derived d is invoked, if derived class object is formed, then which, okay, then which class constructor should be invoked? Should invoke this derived class default constructor, but in inheritance, when there is a control here, yes, but in inheritance, why it is not working? Just a minute. Let me share it again. If I bring it to here, then problem. Just a minute. There is some problem here. Okay, let us check the open board here. Okay. So when I invoke this command, let me, what is happening here? System is not responding. Control X, CPP. Now it is responding. Okay, thank God. Okay. So when I invoke this command, okay, it is expected that this command should have invoked the derived class default constructor first, but this is not the actual case. Thing is, when I invoke this command, the control will move directly to the base class default constructor first. It will print this first. After printing this, it will come to the derived class default constructor. Directly, it will not go to the derived class default constructor. First, it will jump to the base class default constructor, do the task which is given in the constructor, then return back to the derived class default constructor. Default constructor will be called because there is no argument passed in the object declaration. I have only declared derived t, but here due to inheritance, it will first go to the base class default constructor, then it will come back to the derived class default constructor, invoke the default constructor of the base class first. This will be invoked first, and this will be invoked second. So let us verify this if my things are correct. Okay, let us execute. Okay, derived d, derived d, but it is given in the context derived, derived. Yes, it is all right. Line number 17. derived. Spellings are correct now. Check it. Copy this. Oh, it is public. It needs to be public because I told na it will be public because by default in C++ the cases are private. the default access specifier is private. So let me just give a slash in here. It is not clearly printed. Make it slash n. Here also make it slash n. Here also make it slash n. Here also make it slash n. So I will tell the reason behind why fast control is moving to the default constructor first of the base class, then it is coming to derived class default constructor. I will come to that. Before verify that what I told is correct or not. Okay. Please don't see the destructor now. First see the constructor. Destructor I will tell later. So when I invoke derived D, then first I told it will jump to the default constructor. It will jump to default constructor first. It will print the things which are present in here. I had base class default constructor called inside it. So it printed that. Secondly, after printing the base class default constructor, it will jump, the control will jump again to derived class default constructor because we invoke derived D. But it is not directly going to derived class default constructor. It is first going to the base class default constructor, doing the task, what is there, and again returning to the derived class default constructor. So first base class default constructor called, then derived class default constructor called, then I will come to destructor part. Okay, I will later come to destructor part. I will later come to destructor part. Okay, so why when I invoke derived D, I create an object D, but first the base class derived default constructor is called. Why it is called? Why there is a linkage between the derived class and base class? When I create a derived class default constructor, automatically memory is being allocated for the base class constructor. Why it is happening so? So there is a implicit mechanism that here there is a thing written base, this is written. Okay, so there is an implicit declaration here, like it is automatically triggering this to this line which I have written. This is implicitly written. You write or not write, when you execute the program, implicitly this is written base bracket base. Here the base class default constructor is being called here. So when the control is reaching here, so let us see the case. See, same output. Base class default constructor called, derived class default constructor called, derived class destructor will come later. Okay, destructor will come later. For the timing, forget the destructor part. I will tell you later. There is a small concept behind destructor. I will tell. So here, what it is happening? I write or not write this line automatically when the program is being executed. Automatically, this base class default constructor is being called here. You don't need to specify, and already implicitly the compiler gives a call to the base class default constructor near the derived class default constructor. When I invoke this command, the control is coming to this line. It is seeing that base class default constructor is being called. So again, it is moving to the base class default constructor, doing the task and returning to this part and executing the derived class default constructor part. This is the concept behind this. Why the control is going back to the base class default constructor when I invoke a command derived class object, when I define a derived class object. Why it is done? This is the reason behind. Implicitly, there is an explicit call to the base class default constructor when the object of the derived class is created. Okay, this is the main concept behind this. Okay, so when I invoke derived class, when I invoke a command derived and I pass an argument type. So you must be thinking that this should invoke the derived class parameterized constructor first, but you are wrong. when this object is declared, it will go to the default constructor of a base class. It will go to direct to default constructor base class. It will print base class default constructor called. Then again, it will come to derived class parameterized constructor called. It will not go to the base class parameterized constructor. Mind it. When you call this derived D and pass a value type to the object, so you must be thinking that it should invoke the derived class parameterized constructor first, but the control will again move directly to the base class parameter default constructor, not the parameterized. The control will move to base class default constructor first. It will execute the commands which are given in the base class default constructor. Then it will return to the derived class parameterized constructor. Just try to understand it. Okay. Because derived class D5, D, and I create an argument 5. It will, you must be thinking, again I am repeating, you must be thinking that it should invoke this 21 to 23 line, but it will not invoke 21 to 23 line, 21 line to 23 line. This will not invoke. It will first invoke from here. The control will jump directly to the base class default constructor. It will print the base class default constructor called. Then the control again will return to line number 21, where derived class parameterized constructor is being called. So let us verify. Okay, ridiculous of D. Okay, I created a D2. Okay, now it will be fine. Okay, are you able to check? Okay, let me just comment this. Together I will check. Together I will. So okay, together I will show. It will be clear. Okay, first I invoke derivability as previously. So first, when I invoke a object, I create an object of the derived class. Then the base class default constructor is being called. Second, after the default constructor base class is called, the control is again returning to the derived class default constructor. First two lines understood. Base class default constructor called. Then after printing the things which are present in the base class default constructor, the control is again returning to derived class default constructor. Secondly, I invoked a command derived D2 5. I created an object D2 and I passed an argument 5. So I passed the argument 5. So what I told, you must be thinking that it should invoke the derived int k 21 line number 21 should invoke, but this is not the case. It will go to the derived class parameterized constructor called y. Okay, yes, right. But it will go to the derived class or base class default constructor first. From here, the control will jump again to line number 6, and will print again the default constructor. Then again, the derived control will turn to derived class int k, then derived class default derived class parameters constructor is called. But why? One thing you question is why this is not invoking the base class parameterized constructor? Why it is always invoking the base class default constructor? Can't I invoke a base class parameterized constructor? But here I am invoking the derived class parameterized constructor. I am able to invoke in the same way. I should be able to invoke the base class parameterized constructor. There should be must be a way there. So as I discussed previously, explicitly we have a explicit call. We have base class default constructor is being called when I execute the derived class object, derived class constructor here. When line number 18 is executed, by default, there is a default call to the base class default constructor. In the same way, here is also the same line, base class default constructor. The same line is written in every constructor declaration of the derived class, which explicitly calling the base class default constructor. Try to understand the thing. In every constructor declaration, maybe default constructor, maybe parameterized constructor, there is a default line written. You write or not write, it does not depend. when the command will be executed, the compiler will automatically create explicit call to the base class default constructor. In the same way as in line number 18, there is an explicit call to the base class default constructor. In the same way, in line number 21, there is an explicit call to the base class default constructor. But we want that it should call line number 21 should call when the control comes to line number 21, it should find there is an explicit call to the base class parameterized constructor. Explicitly is calling to the base class default constructor. I don't have to do with that because it is explicit, because automatically it will be called. But I need to create an implicit call to the base class parameterized constructor. So what I need to do? I need to just put an argument here. I need to put in just an argument here. When the compiler, when derived D25 is executed, the compiler will come to line number 21 and it will find there is explicit call to, there is implicit, not explicit. Explicit is base class default constructor. I did a thing, I implicitly called, I manipulated the thing, and I implicitly called the base class parameters constructor by giving an argument k to the base class parameters constructor. So let us check what will happen now. See, first I invoked, first two lines are understood. Now see line number 3, the output base class parameters constructor called. Initially base class default constructor was being called, but now base class parameters constructor is being called. This is the way in which the base class parameterized constructors are being called, by overcoming the implicit call of the default constructor of the base class in inheritance. This is the sequence of calling of the constructors in C++. Similarly, we talked a lot about constructors. So now let's come to destructor. So first construction is being done. Now after construction, the program execution completes. So the memory which is allocated should be returned to the compiler, should be freed up, isn't it? So the way in which the constructor is called, the oppositely the destructor is called. When derived D is called, it was first invoked into the base class default constructor. It was not directly invoking the derived class default constructor. Okay. So, but destructor, when it is called, it comes to be derived class destructor called, base class destructor called. It is opposite, completely opposite. There is no logic behind it. The way the memory will be allocated, the reverse will be the way the memory will be destroyed. Okay. So this is the case here of constructor and destructor. Thank you.